substantial contributions to multiple areas of digital humanities, most prominently corpus and computational linguistics, as well as computational literary studies. She was one of the constituting, I would say, an exceedingly productive figures of the digital humanities in Russia. She founded, together with Frank Fischer, the Digital Humanities Center at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, offering IT consultancy for humanities projects, and also dedicated to popularization of DH among scholars. She was also founder and director of 2 master's programs, one for computational linguistics and for DH, at the Higher School of Economics. And obviously she was also a very popular one. She has been voted multiple times the best teacher of the year at the Faculty of Humanities by the students. And more recently, in reaction to the geopolitical situation, she also co-founded the DH Cloud community, which is meant to bring researchers together, allow them to connect and exchange beyond or irrespective of the political borders. Besides her extensive work in education, Anastasia also published numerous publications and on a broad range of topics, and initiated and participated in multiple DH projects, and maybe most notably the one aiming for improving the traditional national Russian corpus to make it a next generation platform for computational linguistics. And this marvelous achievement of Tolstoy semantic editions, which is an semantically annotated digital edition of all Tolstoy's work, which is 90 volumes. Which is, this project is really, I think, a prime example of digital scholarly work or digital humanities, not only offering application for open online interface for extensive search and exploration of the material, but also the over 16,000 TI files of all Tolstoy's works, letters, and diaries can be found on GitHub for further use encoded in TI. So that's how it should be. And yeah, without further ado, Anastasia, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I just feel myself as having kind of celebration. But I should say that I'm so honored and delighted to have a presentation here today, and I would like first of all to thank Austrian Center of Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage for inviting me and having me here. So my talk today has a very straightforward naming, and I will follow the plan which is delineated by the name. I will first speak about culturomics, and then about construction grammar, and finally about how exploration of constructions can lead to new insights in our understanding of connection and interplay between language and culture. So this is a cover image of Science 2011, and we see a book tornado, which symbolizes the idea of the time continuum, which has been represented by millions of books, which can be represented by millions of books that are not read but calculated. And this is the illustration to the main article in this issue, entitled Quantitative Analysis of Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books. And there is a long list of authors, as you can see, including an unspecified Google Books team, and Peter Novick, a prominent Google person and a father of artificial intelligence. And the most important authors are Jean-Baptiste Michel and Erez Liberman-Eden, who authored and were instrumental in pushing the idea of turning Google Books into Ngram datasets. And as we learned from their book, Uncharted, Big Data as a Lens on Human Culture, both were completing their PhDs at MIT and Harvard in the fields of bioinformatics and the human genome when they first came up with the idea of developing an instrument, a microscope, a telescope, a kind of scope, as they write there, that would measure and quantify human history as a physical object. This paper is a result of the scope idea implemented within the largest digitized book collection ever seen in the world, Google Books. And as we see from the excerpt of the paper annotation here on the slide, they did reckon on scientific breakthrough, and they even created a name for a new terrain, culturomics, which subtly hints on genomics, a subdiscipline of genetics which rests upon genome sequencing and interpretation. So the presumed ambitious intention of the authors was to release a cultured genome which will consolidate the scholars' efforts in new approach to reading and understanding culture. And there is an important characteristics of this paper which makes it outstanding. It was not trendy at all in 2011 to publish a data set that would accompany one's paper and support its findings and reproducibility of the results. But the Culturomics authors do much more than that. So their paper is a companion of the published data sets, and it explains their origin and their scholarly and scientific potential. And what is even more important, it is the very simple and transparent and beautiful search instrument, the Google Ngram Viewer, which makes the data accessible to anyone. It does not require any programming skills, and the use of search operators and wildcards is very simple and well documented. So the idea was not just to publish the cultural genome, but also give absolutely everyone the opportunity to explore it and to find something fascinating. So this was an unprecedented act of free knowledge sharing and, so to say, scientific democratization. And as always, with such processes, there are supporters and opponents. It is noteworthy that the launch of Google Ngram has received a very positive and considerable response in the mass media, but has also led to critical discussions in the scientific community. What seems clear from the main Culturomics paper is that bottom-up searches of the Google Books dataset itself aren't likely to be sufficient to provide really new theoretical insights and interpretations on cultural issue, and that the most interesting results are obtained by incorporating or comparing with other sources. And I show some of them. For example, the first one is devoted to the dark matter of the lexicon, and the authors compare actually the lexic basis of Google Ngrams with the largest dictionaries of English, and they show that like 52% of words actually are not registered in the dictionaries, and they call it the dark matter of the lexicon. And this is, of course, there can be a lot of discussions. What are these 52%? And we all remember the sixth law, so perhaps this is just occasion words and maybe the names and everything, but still that it's kind of new, insightful information. And of course, one of the most popular was the fame study. And we see that to carry out this research, the authors had actually to use Wikipedia to get out names of some prominent people, some well-known people, and then did a lot of work to categorize them into their some groups and categories. And then they could count and compare with Google Books dataset where the fame came to political figures, authors, biologists, and mathematicians. So mathematicians are not popular at all, as we all know. But if you want fame, perhaps you should better become an author. A quick fame is a fame of an author or an actor. This we also know. But the great fame is, of course, political figures. And the one I like most of all in this paper is this suppression index. So The authors have computed a suppression index for each person by dividing their frequency from 1933 to 1945 by the mean frequency in 1922 and 1933 and the 1955 and 1965, and they compared English and German corpora, data sets. And so the idea was that actually if nothing changes in nothing changes in mention of these people, like in English data set, then the suppression indices is, the distribution of suppression indices is tightly centered around unity, but in German we see the distribution is much wider and skewed to the left, and that means that there are some names that have been frequently mentioned and then somehow eluded from the textual material. And I think that this is kind of very elegant and interesting research. But anywhere, after these 10 years, the question arises where there are some limitation of this instrument that have hindered the process of fully establishing the new field of culturomics, which was announced in the annotation. We can see that there are no chairs of culturomics, there are no professors of culturomics, and not even a specialized journal of culturomics. And even if we admit that all these institutional developments take a lot of time, and even more than 12 years, we still do not find workshops on culturomics or conference sections on culturomics. And although there are a lot of papers and presentations dealing with quantitative approaches to cultural and textual analysis, the term itself is not in use and doesn't seem to be adopted by contemporary scholarship. And why are digital humanities scholars so conservative or maybe snobbish? Because actually they usually do not act like this. And so to suggest a possible answer to this question, I will go through the main critical points raised in the discussion of Google Ngrams as a primary source for culturomics research. So there are two types of objections which can briefly be labeled as search problems and data problems. And they can also be defined as precision problems and recall problems, which together affect the reliability of the results. So the most obvious problem is OCR, and for English textual heritage up to 18th century, there is this famous case of long S, which is almost always recognized as an F. So you can see here, there's some excerpts from some Google book, and you see that the optical recognition just puts F everywhere. There should be S, as we can understand, and so there is even such a nice word game to find two English words that differ only in SF and realize that they are almost indistinguishable until the orthographic changes in the 19th century. So you can see cafe and case in this graph. Another search problem and also interesting revelation is that not all words or sequences of letters are equally reliable. And there are homonyms, and since we're not dealing with the registered vocabulary, but with the dark lexicon matter, we cannot always predict possible orthographic matches. So, I think that this graph is obvious to everybody because we see that in the late 70s, early 80s, when with the development of personal computers, so we get some other meaning of mouse, and we have absolutely astonishing spike, yes, of frequency of mouse. And of course, all these matters well known to lexicographers of all times and languages, all these variants, synonymy, and etc., and all these things that characterize language as an ambiguous and redundant semiotic system. But the problems with the search, namely the poor precision, seem to have at least some chance of being solved. So the OCR can be improved, the variants can be added to the queries, the homonyms should be escaped, Much more serious is the data problem, which comes entirely from the Google Book collection. So this collection was largely created by digitizing the libraries of American universities. So the main problem is that no matter how large the library collections are, chances are that we're studying the representation of university culture, not the culture or history in general. And there is a very nice paper by Pechenik and others that shows the bias towards scientific literature in the late years of the English data set. So the left one is the all English data set, and the right one is the only fiction. And so they compare the small and capital F in the word figure and show the dominance of the capital F, in this, which is surely due to the prevalence of the scientific text in libraries, with like figure, yes, in the second half of the 20th century. I have once listened to a presentation made by the director of the Russian State Library, the largest library in Russia, and was thrilled and shocked to learn that only 10–15% of all books in the library collection have ever been ordered. And this is the typical situation for all national libraries. So what does the frequency of words in books that no one has ever read tells us about cultural trends? So, well, that is an abstract conceptual question which is to be read by probably needs not to be answered right now. Having no other textual data on the past than the library collections, we have no other choice than to deal with it. So, turning back to this analogy of culturomics as genomics, there has been an interesting discussion between a computational linguist, Mark Lieberman, and the journalist from Wall Street Journal, Robert Lee Holtz, as early as 2010, perhaps before the publication of the Culturomics paper. And Mark has published it in its blog in Language Log. And what has caught my attention is the comparison of Google Ngram with the human genome. These are excerpts from emails, and I will quote some passages from there. This is what Mark formulates as response to Robert's question, what does he think of Google's ambitions to digitize the world's libraries? Google is making an important contribution, writes Mark, to the creation of the archives that will make new kinds of work possible. For that, the company deserves everyone's thanks. But there is a potential problem. As it stands, outside scholarly access to this historical archive will be limited to tracking the frequency of words and word strings, what they call in the trade n-grams. This is useful for addressing some questions, but most questions will require other kinds of processing, which are not possible without having the full underlying archive in your digital hands. For the material before 1922, there is no copyright issue. The only barrier is Google's competitive advantage. This puts the rest of us in a difficult position. Given Google's large, well-run and successful effort to digitize these historical collections, for which the economic returns are fairly small on a per-book basis, it's unlikely that anyone else will duplicate their efforts in the visible future. So we are in the situation that we have existed if the Human Genome Project had been entirely private rather than shared. In this analogy, the access to culturomic trajectories to be made available at culturomics.org might correspond to information about the relative frequencies of nucleotide polymorphisms across individuals without access to the underlying genomes. I think this statement is interesting not as an anti-monopolistic claim, but as a statement worth discussing. Is genome comparison a metaphor or a methodological model? And given the bioinformatics background of the creators, I would guess the latter. There was the idea that counting letter sequences could lead to some revealing insights, just as comparing DNA sequences does. But does it truly work that way with language and culture? I would like to refer to the ideas of Yuri Lotman, the prominent philologist and semiotician who worked at the University of Tartu in the second half of the 20th century and was one of the founders of the Moscow Tartu Semiotic School. Yuri Lotman has defined art and culture as secondary modeling systems. Lotman distinguished between the primary semiotic system of natural language and the secondary semiotic system of culture and art, which is built onto the primary language system, but also represents an additional superstructure of elements and rules. I consider this to be a very important reference to the method of culturomics. In order to obtain interpretable results, one must define a cultural frame of the secondary modeling system within which the frequencies of the primary codes, words, can be compared. And as we have seen, that this already was done by the authors of the culturomic paper themselves. I would now like to show some examples of how the Google Ngram dataset can be used in cultural research. The aim of this short demonstration is to show that, firstly, although the word culturomics is not popular, scholars use Google Ngram datasets or large text corpora to study culture. But, secondly, they always use more than just word searches. In general, we can speak of a range of methods and approaches that extend the idea of cultural quantification, overcoming the limitations of Google Ngram and turning culturomics from a method into a field of study. And here perhaps lies the answer to the question why culturomics has not succeeded in developing into a discipline or subdiscipline, because the name was closely linked to the method and the resource, which actually they have their advantages, but they have also serious limitations, whereas the field of interest of quantitative cultural studies is much more broader and more diverse. So I think we could generalize these approaches as bottom-up and top-down. The bottom-up approaches focus on finding how the meaning of words has changed over a period of time. This means that they work with the meaning of the word in a particular cultural setting or frame, or more precisely, they try to refine and explain the specificity of the cultural frame based on the particular meanings of the words. The meaning of the words are captured from vector models or collocations. That means it is not the word strings or letter sequences that are counted, but the context in which they are used. So, this is a table from the work of Chalesworth, Caliskan, and Banaji. Historical representations of social groups across 200 years of word embeddings from Google Books. And it is a very deep and broad work. So what they did, they took different social groups and they counted the most close associates. So they built a vector model out of 5 grams, pentagrams in the Google dataset. And then they found the closest associates to different social groups such as white, black, men, women, Native American white. And then they contrasted them and they showed the words which really characterize one of the group, and then they showed it in dynamics, and they showed how these words changed through, I think, 200 centuries. So this was actually the method to understand how did these social groups represented itself and how they were perceived. Another example I would like to show does not actually concern to Google Ngram dataset, but it also made on very large corpus data. So this is the method of Tony McHenry and his colleagues named usage fluctuation analysis. And the idea is that they compare the collocations and they move the window, the time window through the time scale, diachronic scale, and they show whether the collocations coincide or whether they are different. So, so when they go down, it means that they're different. When they go up, it means that they go convergent. So this is the example of the word whore, and the idea is that in the beginning of the 17th century, it was mostly associated with church and with some religious texts, and then there was a shift in the meaning. Yes, when they go up, they go diversion, sorry. When they go down, then there is some kind of extension. So there was a shift in the meaning in the middle of the 17th century, and then this word got some negative connotations, and then there was extension of the pragmatic range of the word whore towards being an assault against forces the word to shift away from being most commonly related from anti-Catholicism, from which it started. So this is a very, very, very detailed examination of the word change, which is actually compared with the social processes which take place in the specific community and in the specific time period. So the top-down approaches, on the other hand, to use an external source as a reference that helps them to select the most important conceptual language elements and then examine their interaction and mutual inferences or their differences. So this is more a study of primary language building blocks of some secondary cultural phenomena in Lotman sense. So I would like to demonstrate some figures from the work of Williams, Culturomics, and the representation of the language of the Third Reich in digitized books. So what he did, he took a vocabulary of the language of the Third Reich, and he studied whether these words were used only during this period, and they did not come in the German language after the end of the Nazi regime, having very strong connotations with specifically this time, or there were also some other words which were, for example, the word Grossoffensiv was actually used by Goebbels to to give enthusiasm about some actions, but actually it stayed in German language and lost all connotations with those who have first used it. And also he showed that there are some archaic words which came to the Nazi regime. So this is, we have this kind of frame of totalitarian Nazi language already established, already kind of theoretical knowledge, but we do get more information how it worked, how it was used to. And another example is the work of author, Big Data for the Humanities using Google Ngrams, discovering hidden patterns of conceptual trends. And this is a very nice paper. So what author did, he first compared 3 words with big letter, with capital letter, which started with 1 capital letter, truth, love, and justice, and got a spike in the beginning of the 18th century. And then he tried to find some more specific constructions, and so he found out that actually the most frequent construction of this time is truth of God, and actually the same is with love of God. And so he he extracted the frequency of specific construction of the Enlightenment vocabulary, and then he compared these with theoretical philosophical works by Peter Sorokin, who actually made a big tables of all philosophers, of all categories, and of all their notions, and they get a very good match. So what Peter Sorokin just extracted from the reading these books, and it was like kind of concepts and ideas, offer just matched with specific linguistic constructions, and we do see this, the frequency, not just of the words, but specifically of these constructions, and I can even argue that even these 3 words with capital letters, these are also, they mark these conceptual constructions, and they somehow hint us that there are some specific, this is some specific terminology, and this is some specific conceptual complex around them. So the method used by Orphan is not only to compare the words or even their context, but he gradually specified the constructions that play a crucial role in the cultural area in which he's interested. And this leads us finally to the second part of my talk today, to construction grammar, which was founded by linguists Filmer, Lakoff, and Goddard, and is one of the fastest developing fields of linguistics today. So, well, it is a big linguistic theory. I've just put here some brief theoretical explanation, what is the main idea of construction grammar. The trademark characteristics of construction grammar consist in the insight that language is a repertoire of more or less complex patterns constructions. And the idea is that constructions are non-compositional. You cannot figure out what this means unless you know it, and you cannot actually predict the specific grammatical features of how to formulate. And of course, we know this very well when we study some foreign language and we try to translate word by word, and actually we usually fail. So the idea is that there is form in construction, which may refer to some kind of combination of syntactic, morphological, or prosodic patterns, and meaning, which is understood in a broad sense that includes lexical, semantical, pragmatics, and discourse structure. And usually you have some kind of locked part of the construction, and this kind of slot which can be filled, but perhaps with some kind of limitation. So the classic world of Filmer, from which I think the construction theory started, is the work, the English construction let alone. And he considers about what can we say let alone something. So what can be filled in this slot. And so what we're interested in is actually what can fill these slots. So the construction grammar is a linguistic theory of language that explains how it works, how it is acquired, and how it changes. Corpora are the most important sources of construction evidence, and there are many very interesting diachronic works on constructions, but they also always adhere to intralinguistic features. They are more about these specific interrelations between form and meaning within language as a semiotic structure. But therefore, in early days of corpus and construction research, there was the idea that constructions are a cultural dependent phenomenon. And I would like to cite the work by Stubbs, Collocation and Cultural Connotations of Common Words. So there it is very interesting, and it is both historical because he's doing his research on Brown English corpus, which he has on CD-ROM. It is not very big, and so he says that, okay, I will count only the most frequent words. And what he finds that the most frequent words are usually used in some kind of constructions. And so he says that single words are only rarely the relevant unit for a semantic analysis, and meaning is distributed across the word clusters, which, oh, I'm sorry, there should be some, okay, maybe word clusters dot, dot. They may correspond to a mixture of lemmas, word forms, and frequent but optional elements, as in take a look at. So we have take a look, and then we have two slots. Culture is encoded not just in words, which are obviously ideologically loaded, but also in combinations of very common words. And one textual function of recurrent combinations is to imply that meanings are taken for granted and shared. So if we use the construction grammar approach to diachronical cultural studies, where should we start? Should we extract all constructions? The constructions also change, and we see this very well in linguistic papers. They are very genre-specific. Should we proceed from the bottom up or from the top-down approach? Well, there is much debate about this, but I think that this is the case where the concept of captor, opposed to data, coined by John Drucker, fits very well. So the idea of John Drucker was that actually we should not rely on data in humanities as something given to us, something very objective, but we should somehow collect this data, which makes it not data but captor, from the word to capture. So in conclusion, I would like now to point out some insights that the construction-based approach brings to light. So my idea is to look at the constructions which are part of public discourse, discourse of social power in Van Dijk's terminology. So discourse which influence the mental models of the groups of people in society. So contrary to what I've said, I will not use any external sources other than Google Ngrams. But I have used one linguistic reference, the resource Constructicon, which was created by my colleagues. It is a catalog of Russian constructions and their schematic structure categorized by function and accompanied by English and Norwegian translations. So I looked through this catalog and I found some constructions that could potentially be used in written language. And I tried to make some search queries and refine them to get the most common slot fillers for a given period. So I was focused on what slot fillers of this construction can we have, and whether we can find something interesting. So first of all, I will show you one English construction, and then I will show you two Russian constructions. So I was trying to start with construction so-called. In American English data set in the 19th century, and it seems very interesting for me. So there is some noise, as we can see. This is P and B, and this can be perhaps some kind of initials. I think P is maybe page. But there are two very interesting, well, like three very interesting spikes. One of them can be read very easily, so-called Confederate in the 1860s. So this is the Civil War. And this is the language which was used there. And another is also very interesting, and actually I don't think I can interpret it properly because I'm not a specialist in American rhetorical culture, but we see some kind of very intensive religious discussions. So we see this so-called Orthodox somewhere in the beginning of the 19th century, and then we see this so-called Christian and so-called Christians just before the Civil War started, or maybe just in the 30s, 50s. So let's look at more precisely. So look, I I have a little bit broadened the construction, so now I'm searching for so-called Christian, and I want to see what so-called Christian can be. And we do see a lot of concepts and ideas, which are very popular here in this time. So this is so-called Christian civilization, so-called Christian world, so-called Christian church, Christian nations, Christian countries. And it gives us a hint that this has been a very interesting kind of rhetorical discussion and these kind of mental models that have been built in this particular moment. And perhaps we should explore that. Another example is with the Russian construction "Davno pora." So we could perhaps translate it in English as "it's high time," which is it is a construction. It is not very transparent because in this Russian construction you have this first part "Davno," which it has been a long time, and "pora," which it's time. So it has been a long time to have time too. And then we have this list. So what is its time too? So I have the first half of the 20th century. We have this list, and well, I never thought there are so many stop verbs in Russian, but they're like mostly that's about different kind of stopping. And so I just want to compare two kinds of stopping. I think that's historically very interesting. So one of them, we see this spike. So it's high time to stop, and we should understand that this is the most neutral stop in Russian. This is "Davno pora перестать." And we see this spike in the beginning of the 20th century from 1905 to 1915. And actually, if we put here all this construction and then a wild card, we'll get no results because there are a lot of not very frequent constructions which actually do not fit into these graph limitations. But we can go and look in the data in the Google books. So what do aggregate together to give us this spike here for the construction, it's high time to stop. And we see really a lot of different ideas. Well, these are just several, but there are a lot of them. There are a lot of things the Russian writing people in the beginning of the 20th century thought that we should currently stop to do, like looking at the labor issue as a bogeyman, idolize Asia, pleasing others with hypocritical expectation. This was a political manifest, by the way. Seeing women as an inferior, and so on and so on and so on. So what we see here, we see some kind of expectation, that some kind of discontent, and a lot of discussions. So like a lot of views of what should happen. And what we also see here, that they all stopped when the First World War began. And I would like to compare these results with another line, which is actually also stop, but much more tougher. So we could perhaps translate it, it's high time to put an end, like to kill, like finish. So, and we see two spikes right after the revolution, and the second one is actually, the biggest one is actually in the period of Stalin's terror. And if we look at the data, we don't see this diversity at all, but actually what we see here is that is the citation from some speeches, so we should put an end to disgraceful stain of something, maybe, I don't know, some I don't remember what, of some disgrace. So that is much more aggressive and much more united. And actually it reflects the mental model or perhaps the mental model implied to the society at this period. And so I would like To finish with the last construction, I found also this here in Google Ngrams, which actually really surprised me. I didn't, because I thought it to be very, very concrete and then very, very specific, and then I understood the reason why. So this is this construction long live, and there are a lot of brands. So long live revolution, long live freedom, peace, socialism, friendship, then long live contract, comrade, republic, power, leader, and union. And of course, these are all kind of Soviet propaganda. But I'm interested in this specific spike here, which stands for long live comrade. And actually, we see here 3 comrades. So we see long live comrade Stalin, which dominates all others. We see long live comrade Lenin, which actually is kind of distributed evenly. And we see 2 Lilliputs, Molotov and Voroshilov, which are somewhere from Stalin's company. What is interesting here, that I usually use smoothing, but here I did not. And what we see here is actually that all these spikes, they do coincide very precisely with the years with the waves of repression. So this is 1937. This is the first big terror. And then we have this 1951, which is the last wave of repression after war, where people did have some kind of expectations of something that would change. And Stalin, just before 2 years before his death, has started the new and rather severe way of repression. And so, it is the interesting thing, because actually this long live expression is kind of performative one, and so we can speak, what? Oh, here, we can, yes, we can, it's more about talks, but not about written texts. And so, of course, I also went to the sources, and I just looked through Google Books, and I tried to understand where do we get it. And what I got is that actually we get the same texts, and these are all the same speeches of some person, maybe, which were published everywhere. So you see some examples of some journals which we find the speech. So this is Novy Mir, New World. This is a very famous literary journal, still alive in Russia, and usually like the new novels, stories, and poems are written there. This is Advances in Physics. This is Table Calendar for Farmerman, Notes of Cameraman, Building Industry, Primary School Journal, everywhere. And I thought that is a very interesting point, because one of the greatest critics of Google's books was its unbalancing, yes? And we have the same text many times, and then one important text only once. But now, from here, we get the idea how this propaganda works, how it does really works, that you have this text which is published everywhere in the same thing, and so we get this in Google Graph like that. Thank you very much. That's all.